In this video demonstration, we'll be demonstrating how to use radio buttons of various types within SmartForm Composer. Things are a little bit interesting in SmartForm Composer and a little confusing, so I want to take you through this quite slowly. You will see a radio button widget on the widgets panel within Composer. However, you can't use radio buttons on their own. You have to put them within a radio button group. The radio button group is actually implemented as a block within Composer. So the first thing I need to do is drag in that radio button group. Now there are also a couple of predefined radio button groups, and you may see more or less of them on your particular template, but the first thing I'm going to do is drag in this radio button group and add it to my form. It has a name but no label, and I can just call it title group. It has no visible representation on the form. It's simply a grouping concept for the radio buttons that are part of this group. Once I have my radio button group, I can then go onto the widget section and start dropping in my radio buttons. So I might do the first one as Mr. The second one as Mrs. And the third one as Miss. Presuming that's what I needed in the form. I do have the option of using the title group to change the layout of the three radio buttons that I've defined. So if I double click on title group, you'll see that there is a layout tab, and at the moment I've said that the layout manager I want is flow top to bottom, which means that the radio buttons that are part of this group will flow from top to bottom. But I can also, for example, select flow left to right, and that will change the way that the radio buttons are represented and have them flowing from the left to the right. I can also select grid, which allows me to control quite explicitly how many columns I have and how I want them arranged. Different types of layout managers are explained in more detail in the video on laying out your form. Let's take a quick look at how this looks in the final PDF. Here you'll see the classic radio button behavior, in that if I select that radio button, it's selected. If I select a different radio button, the first radio button is deselected, etc. In this particular style sheet, the radio buttons are designated to be represented with checkboxes rather than the traditional rounded boxes, but that can be controlled through the style sheet. Regular radio buttons are appropriate in most cases, and you should use them in general. However, there are a couple of cases where an Avoka special control called the Smart Radio button is preferable, and we'll try and look at some of those now. There are two cases where the standard radio buttons don't work very well. The first is where the two radio buttons are not necessarily co-located. In other words, if they're not right next to each other on the form. The second, which is related, is if there is content associated with selecting a radio button, additional content, additional fields that you need to enter. And I'll show you how this works in the case of this particular form, which has something called a legal entity. Now, a legal entity can either be a person or a company. Either are valid, and both can be used. So what we're going to use in this case is we're going to use a smart radio button with content. This is on the block section, because remember that blocks are types of objects that can contain other objects. So I'm going to drag over a smart radio button, and I'm going to call this one person. The next thing I need to do is, because these two radio buttons aren't located right next to each other, which is normally how reader knows to unselect one when you select the one near it, we need to identify these as being both part of the same group, and we can give any group name we want as long as it's consistent between the various radio buttons. So I'm going to call that one person with a group of group 1, and then I'm going to drag in a second radio button called company, and I'm going to give it exactly the same group name, group 1. You'll notice that this is a block, so person has, it's actually a block that contains a real radio button, And it also contains a thing called a content area. And what I can do is I can drag additional content into that content area. In the case of a person, I might want to drag in a first and last name. So I'll drag in a text field into the content area and say name. And I might drag another field, which is family name. And I might keep this on the same line as the previous one, as the previous field. And in the case of the company, I might drag a different bit of content or a different field into the content area, namely company name. And we're done. Having a look at the implementation of that on the actual form, we have again our two radio buttons. Now these are not co-located, and so we use the group 1 concept to make sure that when that button is checked, the other one is unchecked, etc. Again, the style sheet is making this a square button. But in addition, the subfields are given some specific behavior, which in this case is that only the one that is checked is enabled and the others are grayed out. Now, we can actually change that behavior slightly, and I'll show you how we can do that. So I'll go into the person radio button, smart radio button, go to the data tab. You'll see there's the button group name, which is necessary to make sure that the two buttons know about each other. But the grey out policy is grey out children. What I might do instead is to say hide the children and exclude them from the layout. That means that the form will collapse to remove any space that is used when those are hidden. And I'll do the same for the company. You would often actually set this policy in the style sheet so that you don't have to do it in every single field. If we have a look at that and then preview, what we'll see is similar but slightly different behavior. This time, if I click the person radio button, I have family name and given name displayed. If I change that to company, those will be hidden and collapsed so that I only enter the company name. As a final caution, smart radio buttons are limited in one respect, that they cannot easily be bound to your schema. So you should consider smart radio buttons to simply be a way of controlling the flow or the layout of your form and not necessarily bound to data schema. However, we will work on this in a future release.